boy in a wheelchair suddenly heard a whimpering sound while walking in the woods. He followed the sound and found a badly injured and chained German shepherd. The frightened boy immediately returned home, but was surprised. Ethan Carter, a 12-year-old boy but seemed to hold more years than his age suggested, guided his electric wheelchair in the forest near his grandmother's modest wooden house in rural South Texas. The sun blazed overhead, while cicadas buzzed incessantly from the thick tangle of pines and oaks that loomed to his right, their chorus blending with the low hum of the wheelchair's motor as it churned steadily forward. 5 years earlier, when he was just 7, a car accident had stolen both his parents in an instant. His father's laughter and his mother's gentle songs snuffed out on a rain-slicked highway and left Ethan paralyzed from the waist down, a sudden and irreversible shift that had uprooted his life and deposited him here, in this quiet corner of the world, under the care of his grandmother, whose weathered hands and soft voice were now his only tether to family. The path he traveled was one he'd come to know intimately, a winding ribbon of dust and gravel that offered an escape from the suffocating pity he'd once endured at his old school, where classmates had whispered useless behind his back and teachers had fumbled through awkward attempts at kindness, their eyes betraying a discomfort he'd grown to despise. Here, in the stillness of the countryside, with only the trees and the sky as witnesses, Ethan found a refuge that suited him better than the crowded hallways and forced smiles of that former life. A solitude he didn't resent but embraced, as familiar to him as the rhythmic creak of his wheelchair rolling over dry ground. The house he shared with his grandmother sat a quarter-mile back, its sagging porch and peeling paint a testament to years of hard living, but it was home now, a place where he could breathe without the weight of others' expectations pressing down on him. Ethan didn't hate the loneliness. He'd grown accustomed to it, like the way he'd adjusted to the faint vibration of the chair beneath him, or the sweat that beaded on his forehead under the unforgiving sun. And in that acceptance, there flickered a fragile thread of something like peace. Though his body bore the scars of a shattered past, his spirit hadn't entirely surrendered. In the way he tilted his head to catch the rustle of leaves or paused to watch a hawk circle overhead, there lingered a quiet resilience, a spark of hope, buried deep within the boy who'd chosen isolation over pity. As the forest shadows stretched longer and the afternoon waned, Ethan pressed on, carried forward by the hum of his wheels and the unspoken promise of something waiting just beyond the next bend. As Ethan maneuvered his electric wheelchair further along the familiar dirt path that skirted the edge of the forest, the cicada's relentless hum filling the thick, humid air of the South Texas afternoon, a faint sound, a soft, pitiful whimper, drifted from the shadowed depths of the trees, cutting through the steady drone and pulling his attention toward the undergrowth, where the noise soon sharpened into a hoarse, desperate bark that seemed to plead for rescue. Drawn by an instinct he couldn't name, he steered off the path, the wheels of his chair crunching over brittle grass and snapping twigs as he pushed deeper into the woods, where he soon spotted a skeletal German shepherd, its matted fur caked with mud and blood, tethered to a rusted stake by a chain that had rubbed raw, oozing sores into its neck, though its clouded eyes still glinted with a fragile spark of hope. The dog, Ethan named it Ranger, lay trembling on the forest floor, its ribs starkly visible beneath its battered coat, and the sight of it, abandoned and broken, struck Ethan with a pang of recognition so fierce that he whispered under his breath, "Who could do this to you?" as if the question might summon an answer from the silent pines. Though the uneven terrain snagged at his chair and thorny branches scratched at his arms, leaving thin red lines across his skin, Ethan pressed forward, repelled by a surge of empathy that drowned out the ache in his body and the limitations he'd long accepted, determined to reach the suffering creature, even if it meant straining every muscle he could still command. Backtracking briefly to the house, he retrieved a small fruit knife and a sturdy wooden stick from his grandmother's cluttered porch, then returned to Ranger's side, where he set to work with trembling hands, not from fear, but from the certainty that he had to do this, for himself as much as for the pitiful animal before him, and began sawing at the rusted chain, his breaths coming in short, ragged bursts as the blade bit slowly through the metal. "Not today," he muttered through gritted teeth, a defiance rising within him against the cruelty that had left Ranger to waste away, his resolve hardening with each scrape of the knife until, with a final laborious twist, The chain snapped free, clattering to the ground as the dog let out a weak, grateful whine. Ethan's small hands shook as he reached out to stroke Ranger's matted head, the boy's heart swelling with a mix of sorrow for the pain he'd witnessed and a quiet triumph born of his own stubborn will. A flicker of compassion igniting within him like a flame that refused to be snuffed out. In that moment, as the forest shadows deepened around them and Ranger's trusting eyes met his own, Ethan felt a connection take root. A fragile bond, forged in shared wounds and the unspoken promise of healing. When Ethan finally brought Ranger home, coaxing the frail, shivering dog onto an old tricycle he'd rigged with a basket, a creaky relic from his grandmother's shed that groaned under the weight but rolled true along the dusty path from the forest, he guided them back to the small wooden house where the late afternoon sun slanted through grimy windows, casting golden stripes across the worn floorboards. As he and his grandmother knelt together near the fireplace, its embers crackling faintly against the encroaching chill, to tend to the wounded creature whose matted fur clung to oozing sores and whose clouded eyes flickered with a distrust that seemed carved into his very being. His grandmother, her silver hair catching the firelight and her rough hands moving with the steady grace of someone who'd patched up more than her share of broken things, fetched a chipped enamel basin of warm water, a rag and a jar of salve she'd kept from her days tending livestock, murmuring to Ethan that they'd need to clean the dog's wounds before infection set in. And together they worked. Ethan cradling Ranger's trembling head with a gentleness he'd learned from years of navigating his own fragility, while she dabbed at the crusted blood and mud around the dog's neck where the rusted chain had bitten deep, wincing as each swipe revealed raw, pink flesh beneath, her soft assurances weaving with Ethan's whispered apologies as Ranger whimpered, too weak to resist but too wary to relax. The task stretched into the evening, the room filling with the sharp scent of antiseptic and the rhythmic creak of the rocking chair where his grandmother paused to catch her breath, her gaze lingering on the boy and the dog with a mixture of pride and sorrow. And when they finished, she shuffled to stoke the fire, her quiet nod from the kitchen doorway a silent blessing as Ethan settled Ranger on a folded quilt, leaving water and bread within reach, but never forcing the dog to take it, trusting that time would soften the fear etched into his trembling frame. Days stretched into weeks, and Ethan, with a persistence rooted in his own unspoken scars, wove Ranger into the rhythm of his life, rising each morning to cook watery chicken porridge in a dented pot he'd hauled from a cupboard, the steam curling upward as he spoke softly. "I can't walk anymore either, you know, not since the car flipped and took everything." His voice a soothing thread that mingled with the low hum of the television he left on, its muted chatter about distant lands and wild creatures filling the silence as Ranger's ears twitched, the first sign he was listening to the boy who refused to give up on him. The dog's opening unfolded in fragile increments. On the third day, when Ethan nudged the bowl closer, Ranger sniffed it, his nose quivering, before he lapped at the broth with a tentative tongue, his eyes lifting to meet Ethan's as if gauging whether this kindness held a hidden cost. By the fifth, he inched nearer to the wheelchair, no longer flattening himself against the wall, but pausing midway across the floor, his nose brushing Ethan's outstretched hand for a fleeting second before retreating to his quilted corner. His grandmother's love worked its own quiet magic, her gentle humming as she stirred the pot or knelt to drape a tattered blanket over Ranger's thin form, softened his wary glances, and once, on a rainy afternoon when she offered a scrap of bread from her palm, he took it without flinching, his muzzle lingering near her fingers as if savoring the warmth of her touch, a silent nod to the care she poured into their makeshift family. Ethan watched these moments from his chair, his heart swelling with a fragile pride, and one evening, as the flickering light of a nature documentary danced across the room, images of vast plains and roaming herds casting shadows on the peeling walls, he knelt beside the dog and whispered, "You're actually my best friend." And though Ranger didn't stir, the boys sensed a shift, a tentative bridge forming between their battered souls. The turning point came after nearly a month, on a crisp morning when the air carried the bite of early fall and the forest beyond the house stood shrouded in mist. As Ethan awoke to find Ranger stretched out beside his wheelchair, the dog's head resting near the wheel as if guarding him through the night, his breathing steady and his body relaxed in a way Ethan hadn't seen before, prompting the boy to fasten a tiny bell to the chair's frame with a length of twine he'd found in a drawer, declaring with a shy smile that spread slowly across his face, "Now you'll always know where I am," a gesture that drew a faint wag from Ranger's tail, the first bloom of trust unfurling like a flower after a long drought. Through it all, his grandmother lent her hands unwavering as she helped Ethan lift the pot of porridge or fetched a chipped bowl to replace the one Ranger had nudged across the floor. Her soft hums weaving through the house like a lullaby that eased the tension from the air, binding the trio in a fragile but growing harmony that felt as tangible as the scent of wood smoke drifting from the hearth. The bell's gentle jingle didn't just guide Ranger, it tugged Ethan from the shadows he'd inhabited too long, each ring a note of hope as the boy and his companion, two broken spirits tethered by patience and love, began to heal together. Their quiet companionship a balm against the wounds the world had left behind. On a stifling night when the air in the small wooden house hung thick and still, Ethan awoke to a sudden, searing pain that lanced through his spine like a jagged blade, a cruel echo of the accident that had stolen his legs years ago, the agony radiating outward until his skin prickled with sweat and his trembling hands fumbled in the dark, reaching for the bottle of pills on the nightstand, but falling short as his fingers clawed uselessly at the edge, his breaths coming in shallow, panicked gasps. The room spun around him, shadows twisting in the faint moonlight that seeped through the curtains, and just as despair began to tighten its grip, Ranger, alerted by the boy's stifled cries, burst into action, his paws thundering across the floorboards with a frantic rhythm that shattered the silence, his hoarse barks erupting in a wild crescendo as he leapt onto the bed, his tongue swiping across Ethan's clammy face, while his front legs pawed insistently at the boy's arm, nudging it toward the nightstand until Ethan's fingers closed around the bottle, the cap popping free with a desperate twist. Swallowing the pills dry, Ethan collapsed back against the pillow, his chest heaving as the pain ebbed slowly into a dull ache, his hand instinctively finding Ranger's coarse fur and resting there, the dog's warm weight pressing against his side as he whispered hoarsely, "You stayed," the words trembling with a gratitude that welled up from a place he'd long kept buried. In those frantic moments, as the storm of agony had threatened to swallow him whole, Ethan had teetered on the edge of a familiar loneliness, the kind that had shadowed him since the crash. But Ranger's fierce determination, the way he'd raced to his aid, his eyes glinting with an unwavering resolve, pulled him back, transforming the dog from a quiet companion into a lifeline he hadn't known he needed. Now, lying there with his breath steadying and the night settling back into its hush, Ethan felt the weight of his isolation lift, replaced by a quiet certainty that he was no longer alone, that this scrappy, loyal creature had chosen him as fiercely as he'd chosen it, their bond sealed in the chaos of that midnight ordeal. In the haze of pain, Ranger had been more than just a dog. He was the sole light Ethan clung to, a beacon of loyalty that pierced the darkness and promised, without words, that they would face whatever came next together. And it wasn't long before the next challenge. On a rainy night, as thunder rumbled over South Texas and lightning streaked across the horizon, a thin wisp of smoke curled from a corner of the small cabin where a frayed electrical wire sparked unnoticed, its acrid smell wafting into the air until Ranger's frantic barking pierced the roar of the storm. The dog lunging toward the smoldering curtains as the flames licked upward, his teeth biting into the burning fabric and pulling it down in a desperate panic before he lunged for the back door, slamming against the bars until it opened, revealing a rain-soaked exit. Ethan, awakened by the chaos, coughed violently as smoke filled his lungs, his wheelchair lurching forward through the fog as Ranger bit his heels, leading him out into the muddy yard where his grandmother, awakened by the commotion, stumbled out of the room and held him sobbing, her tears mixing with the rain as Ethan, his voice hoarse from the smoke, bent over Ranger's drenched fur and whispered, "You saved me again," his hand shaking as it rested on the swaying dog's side. The fire had consumed half the house before the volunteer firefighters arrived, their hoses dousing the flames in the relentless downpour of the storm, leaving the three huddled under a tarp. Shaken but alive, the bond between boy and dog forged anew in the ordeal of that dangerous night. Days later, as the charred remains of the house still smoldered in his memory, a sleek truck rolled down the dirt road, carrying representatives from a dog training organization, their crisp uniforms and heartfelt words painting a picture of Ranger as a potential service dog for others, an offer Ethan initially accepted with a heavy heart, thinking it might be best for the dog who had proven himself to be extraordinary, until Ranger, sensing the moment of parting, refused to leave Ethan's side, his legs clinging tightly to the wheelchair as he ignored the calls of strangers, his eyes fixed on the boy with a quiet, unwavering determination. Ethan, watching this defiance unfold, felt tears well up in his eyes, a smile forming as he wiped his eyes and said, "I think he made his choice." His voice ringing with joy mixed with pride and relief, realizing that Ranger's loyalty was not just a reflex but a decision that reflected his own desire to hold on to this unexpected family. Ranger had not only opened a door out of the fire but also opened up a world that Ethan thought had been closed forever, a testament to a devotion that no fire could sever. Years after the fire that had tested their bond, Ethan, now a young man with a quiet strength honed by adversity, transformed the overgrown backyard of their rebuilt home into Wind Chimes Haven, a sanctuary where kennels crafted from salvaged wood and smooth pathways carved through the earth welcomed abandoned dogs and children with disabilities, a vision brought to life with his grandmother's steadfast hands mixing mortar, neighbors hauling timber under the Texas sun, and a small community center rising at its heart, its walls adorned with wind chimes that tinkled softly in the breeze, each note a tribute to the resilience he'd found with Ranger at his side. Ranger, his fur now streaked with silver and his steps slower, roamed the haven as its gentle guardian, his presence a comfort to the lost souls who arrived seeking refuge, while Ethan, pushing his wheelchair along the paths he'd designed, taught kids like him to see possibility where they'd once seen limits, his laughter mingling with the dog's playful barks as the haven grew into a beacon of hope. The wind chimes didn't just ring for Ethan and Ranger, they sang for every forgotten spirit, proving that from small acts of love, a legacy could bloom.